Wait. Before we start, just want to make sure we're clear here. While this podcast talks about sobriety, mental health, and addiction, it is not meant to replace professional medical advice. Welcome to Sisters in Sobriety.
I'm Kathleen.
And I'm Sonia.
And we're ex-sisters-in-law, brought together in marriage and bonded through our sobriety journey.
Join us as we talk sobriety, addiction, and everything in between. You're in for quite a ride. And our Substack is buzzing with amazing content, from creative mocktail recipes to insightful courses and reflective exercises. There is something for everyone. Don't miss out. It's a great way to add some extra joy and depth to your journey. Check it out. Welcome to Sisters in Sobriety. Today, we're joined by Bizzie Gold, the founder of The Break Method. And Bizzie has built a powerful system for emotional repatterning that helps people uncover subconscious loops, dismantle self-deception, and rewire their brains for lasting change. Her approach is practical, but it doesn't rely on just surface-level coping strategies. Instead, she equips people with tools to disrupt destructive patterns and step into their real agency. Welcome, Bizzie.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
Me too. Thanks for being here. So let's start at the beginning. So how did your upbringing and your early environment shape this curiosity about human behavior?
I grew up living a life of juxtaposition, so lots of wealth and access, and then simultaneous to the things that look nice on the outside. So much emotional turmoil at home, unable to trust parental caregivers, parents that say one thing and do another, and then a lot of infighting between my parents. And I think naturally when childhood environments become that way, there tends to be one person that naturally steps in as a peacekeeper and mediator, and that was me. So I was the one that, was one part lawyer, one part therapist, one part mediator, and my parents, I think, kind of utilized me in that position, likely as early as 4 or 5. So I grew up in that space having to develop really strong pattern recognition skills, learn how to read what my parents' moods likely were so that I could figure out what things I had to take care of or take care of on my own, or how I had to kind of step in to buffer or protect my sister. So I think a lot of this curiosity started just from those early childhood ages of, frankly, being too aware for my own good at such a young age. I really thought and felt more like an adult, even in kind of single-digit years, which I think for little kids can be a pretty heavy burden, and it can actually lead to a lot of anxiety, which I eventually developed, because you're trying to understand complex problems that are really not age appropriate, and that burden can then make you stop sleeping. I struggled with insomnia for a really long time, and I started having panic attacks when I was 9, and they didn't go away until I was 19. So much of my childhood was very much centered around panic attacks, trying to avoid them, being worried that I couldn't go somewhere for fear of having a panic attack. So I kind of got myself into this cat and mouse game where I was trying to avoid having a panic attack. But as anyone who's struggled with anxiety knows, a lot of your attempts to avoid a panic attack actually cause the panic attack, which I eventually found in later years of my life. So all of those things very much established this understanding of, the need for curiosity in the mental health field and a desire to solve problems, because I think I was always thrust into that position naturally of being a problem solver. And I have this kind of pivotal moment that I talk about at the beginning of my book when I was 13, and I went to go watch the movie Fight Club. Have you ever seen the movie Fight Club?
Yes.
Okay. So I didn't mention this, but growing up, my mom also struggled with borderline personality disorder. So if anyone's ever dealt with that, in particular for a female child, it can really be a challenge, because there tends to be a level of jealousy and competition with the female child that obviously would make no sense in the context of a mother-daughter relationship. So much of that, like, negativity and constant criticism, or if you did well at something, then you kind of have this almost like narcissistic flavor on it of, oh, that's because you're just like me. So there's there's both this like seething hatred of you as the child, which is very palpable, but then also kind of this like ego driven obsession with you. Like my mom was always very obsessed with my beauty and my hair, and like made me start getting my hair highlighted at a young age, even when I didn't want to highlight my hair because she really wanted my hair to stay blonde. So just examples of that. I just dealing with her felt to me like being punked every single day of my life, because I didn't have the term for gaslighting then, but I knew that what she was saying and how she was interacting with me was not based in objective reality, but because of the inherent power dynamics in a parent and child, like I kind of just had to shove it down and just accept that. And it wasn't until I watched the movie Fight Club and in the very final scenes, I realized that people struggling with mental illness may actually be completely blissfully unaware that they are not seeing objective reality. And I actually never considered that before. So at watching this moment where you see that the two characters are in fact one character and he had no idea, it gave me just an immediate sense of compassion and empathy for my mom. And instead of being enraged, I felt a call to figure out, what is self-deception? What causes it? What are the mechanisms? And why is it that some people can be taught to see it while others can't? Because that's something that's classic of borderline, is that when faced with some of that evidence that what you're experiencing is not rooted in objective reality, there tends to be that sort of splitting or fracturing of reality where they, instead of being able to accept any sort of ownership or accountability, it, goes into projection or deflection or splitting. So from that point, I was very much just focused on solving this problem, figuring out what causes it, and I've essentially been on a mission ever since. And I'm 40 now, so it's been a while.
And so between pursuing this sort of calling, were you seeking help for your own like anxiety, the insomnia, the panic attacks?
No, by the time, so when I was 19, I mean, this is kind of a wild experience, but I actually was raised Jewish. And when I was 19, I was in college and I was having a panic attack while driving my car. And I pulled over because it was a blizzard, and I happened to pull over right by a church. And I walked into the church to just see if they had a bathroom. I wanted to splash some water on my face. And I just had this very divine encounter that changed my life forever. And I ended up happening to go to a church which I'd never been to in my whole life. And the person that was there, immediately once I got out of the bathroom, they were like, "Hey, are you from New York?" And I was like, "Yeah," because we were in Colorado at the time. And he's like, "Yeah, me too." And he's like, "Are you Jewish?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Yeah, me too." And I'm like, "But we're in a church. How, that doesn't seem like it matches." And he's like, "Come into my office. Let's have a chat." So I started going back and having these chats with him. And eventually I actually ended up giving my life to Jesus. And in that transaction, I was in the process of having a panic attack on an airplane. And I put my forehead on the tray table having this panic attack. And I'm like, maybe this is all BS, but Jesus, if you're real, if you can take away this panic attack right now and never give me another one, I will give the rest of my life to you and I'll never look back. And I've never had a panic attack ever since. So I had a radical transformation in that exact moment. So I've thankfully, thank God, just never had to deal with that again. So that wasn't actually something that propelled me in my mental health journey. I was much more propelled by trying to solve this self-deception problem. Because I think sometimes people with anxiety almost have the burden of knowing too much. Like I'd had the opposite of self-deception where it's like I had the burden of knowing too many things and almost being able to simultaneously observe myself as I'm doing things. So, you have like such a heightened level of self-accountability that then it, can be kind of overwhelming. It sounds like that might have resonated with you, right? The burden of knowing too much.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a big part of anxiety. But so it sounds like you had this I'm going to call this like an aha moment.
Oh yeah,
Like
definitely.
the aha moment of all aha
For
moments.
sure.
But
And I know it sounds crazy to some people, but to have panic attacks every single day from 9 to 19, multiple times a day, and not like, slight hyperventilation. We're talking like often would pass out. I couldn't hear, I couldn't see. Like my whole body would shut down multiple times a day. And in this one encounter, it's never happened again my whole life.
and in that moment, did you realize that there were different ways to look at those things?
I mean, my parents had tried everything. So,
Yeah.
for it to go from 9 to 19, like they tried everything. Like therapy, medication, even like all kinds of alternative things, and literally nothing worked. I had both insomnia and panic attacks for years. I would rarely sleep. And I think a lot of people were like, yeah, sure. Literally for years, my parents can attest to this. They eventually just kind of locked their doors and were like, we don't know what to do with you. Like, you're going to have to just deal with it on your own. So yeah, that was, surely that, knowing what I know now about what lack of sleep can do, only compounded the anxiety attack, surely. But really, from 19 forward, none of those were issues for me. Like, sleep wasn't an issue, panic attack, like all of that went away. And really, that was kind of my primary issue, was the panic attacks. But I do think also when you step into something like that, which is honestly, it's like a very contrasted approach to, kind of more the like neurotic, hypochondriac, New York Jewish sort of parental environment in which I had been raised. You kind of then step off the edge into this understanding of like, what really is faith? And I'd never really considered that transactionally before, and how that actually maps over to things in mental health, which in my practice, I call it controlled surrender. Because I think for somebody like me, where your brain thinks so strategically and you understand the world around you like a matrix problem, sometimes you know what to do or what you could do, but you have to actively relinquish that and surrender in spite of knowing all these answers. So it essentially, instead of just kind of a surrender and just like reckless, like, I'm not going to care, I'm not going to think about it. For some people, their brain doesn't function that way. So that is not actually, I think, a worthy pursuit. But controlled surrender is, I know all these things that I could do, but despite that, within my control, I'm actually choosing to let go in this moment and just let it unfold a little bit more and see what happens. And essentially living my life that way has profoundly impacted me, and is certainly part of Break Method as a whole, for sure.
So how did that concept, in like combination with faith and like neuroscience, how did that inform the foundation of Break?
So I think with anything that's been invented from nothing, in essence, because this wasn't something that I went to school for, which, I have obviously the utmost respect for people that go through that process to become credentialed. But at the same time, I do think, especially as we've gone through the accreditation process and pushed through peer-reviewed studies and things like that, sometimes and often in the academic space, the academic system functions a bit like a funnel. So you're kind of taught what to think, and you're taught kind of the standards and the boundaries of the paradigm. And whether explicitly or implicitly, you're taught not to question certain things, right? These are the boundaries. And if you get too close to this boundary, you risk being ostracized by your peers or facing pushback in some way or another. So I do think that often when people are kind of hit more with that like lightning bolt of an invention from something that is outside of those existing paradigms, it's typically a right place at the right time with the right acquired life skills, right? So you have to have, it's like, to have that lightning bolt hit you and have it take root. I think if I hadn't have had that childhood experience, this lightning bolt might not have either mattered to me as much, or it might not have been backed by practical life experience. So I do think that those things have to kind of counter each other, because my own lived experience was something that I then could pull from when hit with this lightning bolt moment that you can't quite explain. So I think right place at the right time, some sort of lightning bolt from wherever of inspiration that I think, is classic of many inventions over time that essentially came from nothing with lived experience. And in those moments, I often joke that Break all started on a napkin having an argument, which is actually the truth. I was having an argument with a friend at a coffee shop, and we were arguing over whether the nature of emotion was inherently masculine or feminine. And that just that conversation topic on its own is what kind of brought Break to life. And in this moment of trying to explain it to her, I started to see all these flashes of diagrams and scales and terminology that I'd never heard before. So I'm sitting there kind of like drawing out these diagrams. And then at the end, she was like, B, I don't know what that was, but you're on to something there. So like, that was weird. Let's keep pursuing that. That just blew my mind. And I'm like, it kind of blew my mind too, because it wasn't it wasn't like I was trying to teach from something that I knew or some acquired knowledge. It just kind of came through. So then I go home and for about a week, but 3 really intense days, but kind of then over a week, ended up again kind of like aggregating all of this terminology and diagrams and things that I was seeing and kind of brought it all to life. And it ended up being about 80 pages of content. And I was in a process at that point in my life where I was already leading a lot of trainings in things like energetic anatomy and how the energetic anatomy kind of mapped over to socio-emotional development. So I was already teaching and lecturing in this space. Previously in my life, I had gone to traditional Chinese medical school. Prior to that, I had kind of a decently long career in hypnotherapy, which I think all these things kind of functionally play a role in what I've ended up creating, because the TCM kind of brings in this sort of esoteric Eastern medicine component that I think very much has a place in us understanding from a more holistic perspective what's happening in mental health. In particular, the type of TCM that my school was very much rooted in was 5 elements. So when you're understanding the 5 elements, there's definitely this really classic foundation of the role emotion plays in kind of our organ systems as a whole, and how either chronic or acute disease comes about, and that there's this inextricable link between disease and emotion, and that you can't really separate the two. So I think really that played a role. The previous experience with hypnotherapy certainly played a role in a foundational understanding of the role the subconscious plays, how the subconscious often presents to many different people, because I had done that for over 5 years with many clients. And one thing that you know from having those repetitive experiences is that it doesn't really matter how distinct and different clients seem. Once you're actually engaging directly with the subconscious, suddenly people aren't so different. Even the cadence of speech and word selection suddenly constrains down, and all these things that maybe when the person's personality and those conscious drivers are ever present, then you're like, oh, this is that person, that's this person. But as soon as you strip those away and then you're engaging the subconscious, suddenly you're like, wow, like something's going on here, because really all of the affect that people put out, that goes away when we're dealing with the subconscious. So is there less of the subconscious sort of variation that there is with our kind of conscious expression of personality? So I think all of those seeds were planted for me to then later on have this aha moment. And because I was already out there teaching and lecturing, I was, again, right place, right time. I'm like, well, let's teach this. Like, let's see what happens here. And very rapidly, I started to have really full seminars. Then we launched the online version of the program in January of 2017. Right out of the starting gate, started to have roughly 500 people go through it every 4 months. So just from the very beginning, it just rapid growth. But one of the things that I was very aware of even back then, and I'm so grateful that I followed this instinct, because I think sometimes people in the early stages, they're so focused on maybe things that don't matter as much, and then they're forgetting about things that maybe should have mattered that you wish you did in the early years. So thankfully, I was on my A game in the early years, and I'm so grateful for it, because I was a stickler for tracking data from the very beginning. So from the very beginning, using a 5-point Likert scale, we tracked incoming symptoms, so both the type of symptom, but also the self-score of the symptom at the start of the program, and then the self-score at the end of the program, tracking a bunch of other data as well. But I was a stickler for that, and everyone that came in had to fill that out. Everyone that came out had to fill that out. And it just so happens that now, years later, because I had all of that aggregated data over years, right? So we're talking like thousands of people, I was able to actually use that in a peer-reviewed study to actually prove not just the efficacy of the program itself, but we were able to do much longer term studies over a variety of different cohorts, and then track all of the efficacy rates of the different cohorts to basically look at, over, I'm giving an arbitrary amount of years, but I think it was relatively over a 6-year period, every single cohort kept the same efficacy rate, which I think for us proves that it wasn't just the one teacher in the one cohort, or like these students were different than these students. Every single cohort maintained the same efficacy rate. So I'm grateful that I did that tracking, because sometimes in the beginning you're like, oh, let's just see what happens, and you don't really pay attention to those details. And thank God I did, because it ended up now years later becoming the foundation of a now on the edge of peer-reviewed study. We're past the first 2 rounds, and they asked us for some formatting revisions that hopefully we'll go through this week. So yeah. So we've tracked that data for years, and every time we ran a cohort, one of the things that I always tried to do was refine the process. What can we have done better? What did we succeed in? Where do we have to make changes? So roughly every single cohort has some refinements all the way until roughly 2022, when in 2022 we shifted from doing it in kind of more of like a college style cohort or a semester model to everybody doing it on their own time with one-on-one support. So all of the sessions, instead of being in a small group environment, switched to one-on-one, and we've been running it that way now ever since. And in 2022, we also took all of the data modeling and we actually turned it into a proprietary algorithm and a tech modality that now people can do to actually figure out their brain pattern markers within 20 minutes. And that's always going to be the first step of break method as a whole.
And so with people who aren't familiar with the language, what exactly is a subconscious pattern? And is that what you're measuring with the data? Is that the symptom essentially that you're measuring?
So essentially the hypothesis in break method is that all mental illness or any maladaptive behavior is a byproduct of a distorted perception of reality. So we talk about this in the term neurocognitive funnel. In essence, your behavior is actually downstream from perception of reality, and you can't actually separate the two. Just like emotion is downstream from perception of reality, and you can't separate those two. So the downstream essentially is at the very top of the funnel. How you perceive reality is going to determine how you're actually organizing the pixels that you're perceiving in your reality, how you're constraining them into a definition. Once we've defined them, our brain has kind of built these rule sets about how we interact with however we've defined it. So an easy way to describe this would be, I grew up, as you guys know now, with a mom that had borderline personality disorder. She also struggled with addiction. So if we give one scenario, right, knowing that perception of reality in part is a sensory experience, let's say that I've just gotten off the bus from school. Let's say I'm 9 years old and I've just had a really bad day at school. Maybe my friends were, bullying me, or a boy that I liked, I found out didn't like me back, right? So my heart is hurting and I'm getting off the bus and I walk into my kitchen. If I walk into the kitchen and in the corner of my eye, I see a bunch of wine bottles underneath the sink, and I see my mom has a little bit of purple on her teeth, and I can kind of smell that smell of wine on her breath. Just based off of those little sensory cues in my environment, if I know that my mom is more aggressive when she's been drinking, without having any conversation with her, without even getting close to her, my brain has scanned those small things in my sensory experience and decided, you have to go upstairs and handle this on your own. Mom's not safe to talk to. Now, let's take the same exact scenario, right? So now different day, but the same thing, same heartbreak. Boy doesn't like me back. Friends talking poorly about me. I got off the bus, but now I come in and the first thing that I smell is Christmas potpourri. And it just so happens that my mom completely changes her personality every year around Christmas. It's this very bizarre thing where all of a sudden, like Christmas, she can pull it all together. So, and she always was boiling this Christmas potpourri. The house would smell good. Suddenly she'd like bake cookies and like everything was homemade. So let's say I now get off the bus, same heartbreak, but I walk into the kitchen and I'm smelling Christmas potpourri. Just from that one sensory input, my brain has now decided you can go to mom and give her a hug and tell her that you had a really bad day. What technically has changed? Really nothing. Like I'm still exactly the same. I'm still experiencing the same heartbreak, and I haven't really tested my environment. It's totally possible that even when my mom had been drinking, I could have gone up to her and said, Mom, I had a really bad day. And maybe she could have gotten out of her own way for 5 minutes and given me a hug and said, I'm really sorry. That must really hurt. But just based on sensory experience alone, I've now completely changed the course of my reality. I turned upstairs rather than turned toward my mom to ask for a hug. So This just, it helps us understand how quickly perception of reality can inform our emotional response, which in turn informs our behavior response. So if we're looking at this neurocognitive funnel, and we know that I've been on this mission to understand, like, what is self-deception and how could somebody not know that they're being deceived, I started to look for what creates that distortion in our perception of reality. How could some of us know and some of us not know? Or how could some of us not know, but then be given the information, accept the information, and be like, oh, that makes so much sense. And then others push that away and kind of double down on either their denial or, in some cases, just flat out their psychosis. What we ended up discovering in Break Method is that is a very specific sequence of childhood inputs that create a pattern of childhood outputs that very much function like a lens of glass. So you wear glasses. I frankly should be wearing glasses right now. I just forgot them in my car. When we put on a lens of glass, it corrects so that we can actually see things clearly. But if I were to put on your glasses, I might see everything distorted, and vice versa if we were to switch. So what ends up happening is that our childhood repetitive inputs that we experience, it puts on a lens of glass that we don't know that we're wearing, and society really doesn't teach us that we're wearing glasses lenses or how to take them off. And there's a very specific process that you can go through both to become aware that perhaps the reality or self-perspective that you thought was so objective may not actually be. And obviously that's confronting. It can be really hard for people, but that really has to be the first step, because then once you understand what went into the glasses prescription, you can take it off and actually in many cases see objective reality for the first time. So we have found through Break Method that there are very specific types of childhood repetitive inputs that create a specific sort of glasses prescription. And in line with that, while there are over 8 billion people in the world, there are really only 5 lens prescriptions, essentially. So imagine that all of those 8 billion people somehow only have 5 different glasses prescriptions available to them. And if we were to kind of look at what creates the curvature of the glass that allows that person to see what they're seeing, that curvature of the glass is a pattern of self-deception. So with Break Method, we're able to see very specifically and very quickly what that unique pattern of self-deception is that's kind of skewing or distorting their perception of reality, and then in turn skewing their emotional experience and their behavior experience. And as this pertains, for example, to addiction, and I think likely you know that I was brought into a program at Johns Hopkins University for innovations in substance use disorder, which is really centered around how technology and innovation can be utilized to solve the substance use crisis. What I have found specifically in Break Method is that within those 5 brain pattern types, there are really only 3 out of the 5 that are inclined toward any sort of substance use disorder. And when looking at patterns of addiction, most sort of addiction medicine or recovery center or anything like that, they tend to address the behavior somewhat at the level of behavior. So kind of trying to change the way a person is engaging with whatever that trigger is, but they're never really, in my opinion, getting to the level of what distorted perception of reality is actually triggering this sort of domino effect that eventually makes them reach for some sort of substance. Because quite often, one of the things we track in Break Method, so we track in brain pattern mapping 9 different markers, and this kind of follows that neurocognitive funnel. The top 2 help us understand the very specific pattern distortion and perception of reality. The middle 3 track early stage transitional and late stage emotional response, so more the biochemical component. And then the bottom 4 track early transitional and late stage behavior, each downstream from the previous. What we've found is that if you understand somebody who's experiencing substance use disorder and you actually look at their brain pattern, you understand specifically where their pattern of use is and what thoughts and what language and distorted perceptions are actually driving them to do something that many of them don't want to do, right? Many people struggling with substance use disorder when they're sober, they don't want to do it, right? But at a certain point, this goes back to the self-deception piece. How can you at one stage not want to do it and then another stage have already convinced yourself that not only should you do it, but it's going to be great, right? Like this is going to be great. This is totally a good idea. it's self-deception. So we have to understand at what stage, very specifically, like really like laser focused, of these 4 positions, where is this person using? Because some people use in early stage, some people use in early transitional, some people use in late stage transitional, and then some people use at the very end of their cycle. And if we just treat all substance use disorder, for example, like if all opiate use disorder is kind of treated this one blanket way, it will work for some and it won't work for others. We have found with break method that if you approach it in this much more parsed out strategic way, you're able to give people the right tools and address the stage that is happening that would eventually create a scenario where then the person wants to use. So we're trying to get them, we have to kind of figure out where in the cycle to input the strategy and the work so that they never create even a thought process or situation that would eventually make them justify the behavior that they don't want to do. So this is very much a battle of kind of, timelines, if you will, where it's like, where's our best in point and where are we going to get the best bang for our buck if we focus our efforts here rather than there? And like I said, I think a lot of substance use disorder clients that come to us, it's kind of like abstinence, these are the ways that you do it. And it's not really addressing like the why, like fundamentally, like, why am I doing this? Why do I see things this way? And if I could see things differently, would I not ever want to reach for this substance? And I think our program is a testament to, yes, in most cases that is true. If you can correct that glasses prescription, the downstream impacts to your environment that might make you want to justify reaching for substance in many cases goes away.
How do you know when someone is ready to begin this type of work, aside from like they've signed up for it?
Right.
What are
I
some
mean,
signs?
you would think that signing up for it makes
Yeah.
them ready, but in some cases that's still not true, especially those that struggle with commitment. So I think to some large extent, technically anybody is ready for this. I've taught this in a very condensed format in a women's prison where, yes, people got to they got to opt in, but I found out, we actually had a huge turnout, which the person that brought me into the prison, they were like, don't take it personally if there's only a few people, because this wasn't like a county jail. This was like a full-blown prison. And she's like, don't take it personally if not that many people show up. And I get there and we're like 55 people deep. And I was like, okay, well, this is like bigger than I thought it was going to be. She's like, yes, this is way bigger than I thought it was going to be. Then of course I get this like, well, don't take it personally if most of these women are just here because they're going to get free food. And I was like, okay, so there's this like constant, like, it's not you, it's this situation. I was like, well, let's just see how this goes. So I basically have to take something that typically I accomplish in a 4-month time period with people who have like paid money, are, wildly invested, ready to put an effort. Then now I have to condense this down to 2 full days. So we're talking like 8-hour days for 2 days. So it was an intensive, but now I'm in a prison system where every 45 minutes a guard has to come in and do these really loud, very, very noisy checks of everybody, right? Because he's got to do counts, and there was all this like aggression between the prisoner, the inmates, and then the guard that had to do these checks. So it's like constant disruption for 2 days. Even with people who may have at one point just been there for the brownies, or just to get out of maybe doing whatever their sort of like work duties were in jail. The amount of people in that room, there was maybe out of 55 people, there may be like 1 or 2 people that ended up not being engaged. Every single person in their room changed their life that day. And I say this because sometimes you don't technically have to be ready, because none of these girls, I think, were ready for what I was there to do. Many, when we were doing exercises on the whiteboard, could barely spell 3 to 4 letter words correctly. So you don't even have to have the academic background to be able to consume this. The structure itself exposes the self-deception. And when you can see the pattern of self-deception and how I can prove in a way that's much more mathematical why this is tied to this and this is tied to this, you can't run from it anymore. And even somebody who, I think for the better part of their lives, because many of these women were, 30s, 40s, 50s, there were some people in their 60s, they had never they'd never considered any of these things before. And once you're faced with it, it is such a radical paradigm shift that it changes the way you perceive reality. And when you see things differently, you do things differently naturally without actually having to white knuckle or force it. When I first got into the room, I did a very specific exercise with them. And I did this for two reasons. Number one, I wanted to actually see who in the room was the leader, right? Who did everybody look to try to figure out how to solve this problem? So that was kind of my primary goal, because I knew that I would have to get them highly engaged for everybody else in the room to follow. But I also wanted to, of course, see what everyone's answers were. So we do this exercise. We start off with, I call it the gumball exercise. So there's a big picture in the front of the room that has a gumball machine that has red and blue gumballs. Right? It's just literally like a clip art picture. But I don't say anything about it. And I give everybody a piece of paper and a pen. And I say, someone from my staff's going to come around with this shoebox. I want you to pick a gumball, write it on the sheet of paper, and then just go ahead and throw that in the box. And just, my staff member is going to walk it up to the front. So I don't ever say explicitly like, pick one of these gumballs. I don't say that it has to be restricted to red or blue. I just say, pick a gumball, write that gumball down on a piece of paper, and then, we're going to pick that up. So I get to the front of the room. I've got everything. And at this point, I saw, because I've run this experiment so many times, I knew the one person that was going to write a color that was not on the wall already. I knew someone was going to do it. Because I saw everybody looking to her like, what is this? Are they trying to trick me? Like, what is this? So what typically happens is you get everybody writing down red or blue, because that's the colors that was on the image behind me. But some people will get really specific, like the third red from the bottom right? Then, of course, you have these rogue outliers that are like gold with black circles, right? And it's very few, typically less than one or two in any group. So I knew that the one that wrote, gold with black spots or whatever, I already knew as soon as I looked at it. I looked at the audience and I was like, guys, do you think that I can guess who wrote this one? And they're like, no, you can't do that. Like, out of 55 people, I was like, I bet you I can guess who wrote this one. And I said it out loud. I'm like, gold with black spots. And I'm like, was it you? And she was like, what? I was like, listen, I partially did this exercise to find you in the room. I was like, do you have your attention now? And she's like, yeah, you got my attention. And I was like, and I bet you're in this room for some really calculated crime that you never thought you were going to get caught for. And she was like, you're right. And she was like, and I got away with it for like 25 years. And I'm like, yeah, well, everyone's luck runs out eventually. You can't strategize your way out of everything if you're doing something illegal. And she started laughing. So at that point, I had kind of the buy-in from everybody in the group. And then I ran another experiment, which is, now here's another piece of paper. Tell me why you're here. Why are you in prison, right? Most people are writing down like what their actual crime was, like what they actually got busted for, right? Like selling drugs. Some people even put like whatever the code was that they violated. But only this one girl that wrote, the gold with the black spots or whatever. She wrote me an interesting message that was, I'm really smart and people depend on me and I had to do what I had to do. Like, fair enough. Because really, she knew it actually was her people pleasing and placating and her lack of self-preservation instinct that made her always put others first, even if that meant doing something illegal, that is what got her into prison. And she was right. So I tried to help people understand that really it is these patterns of self-deception that actually are why you're here in prison today. It's not the one time you got caught for that thing. So that is really going to be true for any one of us. And, I think my husband went into the prison with me. And at first he was like, why are you doing this? Like, why would you put yourself at risk? Blah, blah, blah. By the end, he was so invested in it. And he was, connected with every single one of these women in the room. And he looked at me and he was like, that really opened my eyes because I've done so many of the things that they've done. I just happened to get away with it. Like, it really leveled the playing field that what separates sometimes somebody from prison and you is sometimes luck. Sometimes it's better abilities to mask or cope, but really you could be the same exact person as the person that's in the room and you're free and they're not. So I think that really, helps position break method as if they can do it. And we were able to curb recidivism in that group by, I believe, 64%. And actually, when we left there, I ended up uncovering while I was there that just from reading subtle body cues, that there was something going on with the group that they didn't have the skill set to solve because they believed that the system was stacked against them. And we ended up uncovering during that 2-day event that actually some of the highest ranking guards were sexually abusing them and trafficking drugs through them. And basically there was just this whole basically trafficking scheme and sexual abuse scheme that was happening in the prison. And we were able to actually empower the women in the group with the right skills to actually take it to the higher ups and actually get the problem solved. And it ended up becoming this huge court case because before they were, believing like, I can't trust the system's always out to get me. And I'm like, but is that part of this perception of reality that got you here? And now you're actually poking the bear instead of using the right skills to actually have your voices heard. So all this to say, if I can do that for 55 women in 2 days in the worst circumstances literally ever and have them completely radically change their lives, anybody is ready as long as you're willing to let us keep chasing you, even if you're going to try to run away many times, because it is a triggering experience. But when you get to the other side, it's sustainable and it's something that you can do by yourself for the rest of your life, which to me, I think is the hallmark of where we need the mental health field to go, is that if anything creates dependency or codependency, both financial or emotional, that's not something that I think is truly going to solve the mental health crisis. We need to do things that empower, equip, that are sustainable, that do effectively pass the knowledge of kind of the therapist or practitioner to the client or patient themselves so that they can have some agency, right? That they can learn to do for themselves.
What is that gap between the knowing and the doing, right? I know you said there's some kind of like natural movement from knowing and uncovering the pattern, but when you talk about stopping trafficking operation or reducing recidivism, how do we get there from just identifying to actually making real change?
I think the micro and the macro will always mimic each other, right? So if we think about it on the personal scale, I'll give an example of one of the things that actually happened in this room that helped. And I believe, again, from a spiritual perspective, it was a huge issue that we uncovered, and things were just right through some sort of divine intervention during those 2 days that I think we had the entry point to solve this problem. So example would be this one guard that kept being the one to do the checks. The first time he came in, everyone's behavior that was focused forward, all of a sudden it was like the most immature, abrasive. Everyone turned around. They were heckling him. They were being rude to him. And then he gets out and I was like, whoa, everybody, what was that? I was like, that was absolutely ridiculous. Did you have to do that? And they're like, we don't even understand. He doesn't deserve our respect. Everyone's like yelling at me. And I was like, okay, everybody sit down. I was like, let me break it down for you. And it just so happened that it was actually a part of the teaching anyways. It's something that we call red cone, green cone. And I was explaining to them, I'm like, you're poking the bear because as soon as he comes in there, while you don't think he deserves respect, so you're deciding that I'm going to like heckle him and push his buttons, I kind of broke down my projection of what I thought his brain pattern was. And I was like, what if? And I was like, let's just play a game of what if. What if he was raised in a military family? What if his dad was constantly yelling at him? And what if his dad was constantly like degrading him and shaming him and he's trying to get it right, but his dad's always giving him negative feedback? I'm like, is it possible that while he's trying to take count and you guys are screaming at him and heckling him, he's going to get increasingly more angry because he's trying to do something right, and you guys are now taking the role of his shame-inducing father. So you guys are getting thrown in the hole over something that doesn't seem fair, but you're also playing a role in this. And they're like, huh. I was like, so let's just do an experiment, okay? He's going to come back in 45 minutes. Somebody put an alarm on their phone. The next time he comes in, I want you to do this. I want you to do this. You do. I was like, everybody's got a position to play, okay? Think of this like a game. So he walks in and everyone stays completely quiet, eyes facing me. And I told the one girl, right, the gold with the black dots or whatever, if anyone even starts to look, that you do it for me. You look at them and give them the like, don't you dare. Don't you mess this up. So everyone did exactly what they're supposed to. He walked in And he kind of like looked around like, what? Right? Because it gave him enough of a pattern interrupt that he was now confused. And he didn't even take account and he walked out. And I was like, wait, because I felt that he was going to come back. So he leaves and it's still quiet. And he comes back and he looks again and then quietly goes like this and then kind of looks at me and like tipped his head like, weird. And then he walks out. And then everyone started talking. They're like, what? I can't believe he was capable of doing that. I'm like, I can't believe you were capable of doing that. Isn't that funny? When you do that, he does that. And then there's no problem. No one gets thrown in the hole. He just comes in, he leaves. Like maybe that we're acting on assumptions here that we're actually engaging in. So that example alone, I think, gave me this entryway to be like, is it possible that you are assuming in a way that is restricting the choices that you're aware of and that we actually might have more choice if we do some digging here? So we spent basically 2 days kind of getting to the bottom of what was going on and giving them kind of the how to engage these people that are in power in a different way to kind of get this uncovered. And, you know, it wasn't all rainbows and roses. I think there were even a couple murders that honestly took place around this of people that did try to expose. So it wasn't without drama, because that is, you know, it is true that some systems are corrupt, as some of these prison systems are very corrupt. But how many more people were saved as a result of somebody standing up, despite, you know, how sideways it went in the legal system and things like that. So all this to say, our approach in break method, if we look at kind of the micro mimicking the macro, on the micro level, we have to start to understand how, again, in that top level of perception of reality, how that distortion actually creates language structures that your brain relies on to constrain your ability to see choices or not. Because just like we use the example of my mom either smelling like Christmas potpourri or smelling like alcohol, that one thing is going to kind of expand what I think I can do or constrain what I think I can do. And that's not a conscious process. That is a subconscious process. We're not actively aware. We can't see what we can't see. Example, again, going back to substance use disorder, in the moment that somebody's deciding to perhaps call their dealer, they can't see another option. They're not aware in that moment of reality of not calling their dealer, right? That doesn't come until a later cycle where they're like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. So we have to address the language architectures that the brain generates and dismantle those using a very specific tool and break what that we call Eli. Mm-hmm. So if you think about it this way, these language structures are similar to, like, if I look at this, I'm going to look at that and call this a coffee mug. Somebody else might call it a cup. Somebody else might call it a glass, right? If we take something as simple as this, I would call this a mug. I would look at this and be like, this can go in the dishwasher. But what if somebody that like thinks of this mug as something that was like handmade, it's ceramic, they might be like, you can't put that in the dishwasher. What's wrong with you? Like, well, here we've got one item that's been defined in my world as a mug that probably came from Walmart. And then we might have another person that looks at that mug and they're like, that's not from Walmart. That was handmade. I paid $100 for that. You can't put that in the dishwasher. The language that our brain is generating when we look at something as simple as a mug is going to determine whether this can go in the dishwasher or not, or whether putting it in the dishwasher is cause for a fight or not, right? So that just shows you how arbitrary some of these things are, but how much language drives these things. Another example could be you and I could walk in, let's say that we run a business together and we're walking in to interview candidates. You and I could walk out of interviewing a candidate in the same qualities that I thought were assertive, confident, committed, passionate. I'm like, I love that person. You could walk out being like, that person was egotistical, prideful, boastful. Like, I never would want them in the company. What's objectively true here, right? So in essence, if you think all of those things, you're going to cut them off the list. And if I think all of these things, I'm going to move them to the top of the list. Which one's right? Right? It feels, it's so slippery because it is. So then we have to start to understand, and I think obviously this is very cut and dry when it comes to something like substance use disorder. We have to understand what the person's goal is. And then we have to understand How is this goal not aligning with this distorted perception of reality? And what sequences do we have to correct to get you to this goal? So, to some extent, we have to know what you want that you're not able to get right now so we can figure out why your brain is not letting you get there. And that gap is filled with language architecture. And we have to strategically dismantle that language architecture because your brain views safety as known cause and effect. Even if that known or that familiar is heartbreak, chaos, shame, it'll keep running that same loop because that's what it knows. But also, your brain doesn't want to be in error. So if you can help it strategically see where these sequences are actually in error and not aligned with what you want, oftentimes your brain will naturally open up these possibilities. So something that you never would have thought of before is suddenly front and center, but you didn't have to try because your brain does function like a computer. So if we can kind of change the formula, all of a sudden what your brain is naturally desiring will shift. So I think this is kind of the easiest way to describe this, going from this micro to macro, is if you can get a person to do that, then you can get a system to do the very same thing, and the mechanisms are really ultimately the same because they function very similarly. But the key here is dismantling those systems of language that are downstream from perception of reality.
If someone is listening and they're stuck or overwhelmed in a cycle of addiction right now, what is one simple question they can ask themselves to start spotting their own self-deceptive loops?
I wish that there was a one simple thing. The simplest thing I know is spending 20 minutes doing brain pattern mapping because it's cheap. It's $22. It's actually $21.99. And in 20 minutes, somebody on our team will be able to explain to you exactly where this is coming from and why it's happening. So that's the simplest thing that I can think of because it's basically taken all the guesswork out of it. Because unfortunately, for many people who do struggle with substance use disorder, they would fall into those categories, perhaps at least 2 out of the 3 that I mentioned, where they aren't capable of seeing their own blind spots without at some point going into shame. And then potentially that shame is what actually leads back to the substance use itself. So I think something like break method actually allows you to see those blind spots and understand the mechanisms without having to kind of like force your way through it or be very confronted. And anyone on our team that's going through that information with you, if they understand which one of the things that you would mark for a reason that you're incoming would be addiction, you can actually say, hey, where in this cycle, and for us it would be in the timeline, where in the cycle does my addiction pattern likely reside? And if something is like beyond the scope of what a traditional behavior therapist would be able to go through in something like this, often if there's a really severe pattern of trauma and addiction, it usually will get escalated to me. So whether it's somebody on our team or me, they'll be able to actually break down where our most educated hypothesis of where this is coming from and why it's happening so that we can kind of explain the pathway of what we in our program would do to resolve that. But even if not continuing on into our program, just the insight alone of understanding where it really comes from, I think for a lot of people is one of the most helpful steps because we're often aware of what we do, but we don't really understand why, right? Like that's the thing where we're like, but why do I do it? Like, why do I keep doing this to myself? And I think even in just this 20-minute session then you have about 45 minutes with somebody on our team actually reviewing the findings. In that 45 minutes, you should leave the session really fundamentally understanding why.
Wow. We're going to link to the brain mapping in the show notes, and I'm actually going to do it myself. I'm going to do it later today. Yeah. Bizzie, thank you so
Thank
much for
you.
being with us today. I learned so much. I know that our listeners are probably so excited that you were on and listening to you talk. It's amazing. So what is next for you and for Break Method?
Next for me is definitely the big push because I think we've scaled the company a lot. I definitely want to spend more time this year training more therapists and psychiatrists in the modality. We have about 100 trained so far, but I know that I'm one person, and the more I can get this into the hands of people who are out there wanting to do the work, the better. So that's number one. Number two, and this is just my mission as a whole, I know that what we teach in our break method program needs to be integrated into the school system, and ideally starting in middle school, because if we can teach kids this in a middle school level, many of the issues that adults experience and even some of our societal issues would just frankly cease to exist. So I'm on a mission to integrate this at more the level of Department of Education, because really this should be required of all human beings, and it shouldn't be something that you have to do as a mental health intervention later on. It should be something that we all just know, because if we know it, our entire society and culture would look radically different.
Yeah, I think, and I might like low key send this to my mom too, because my mom is very similar to yours, it sounds like. So,
Awesome.
but I agree. If I had this growing up, things may have been a little bit different, especially in terms of like my addiction. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Busy.
Thank you.
We
I'll
loved
make
having
sure
you
that you
on.
get my VIP link so that I can do your brain pattern mapping session myself.
Awesome. Thank you so
Thank
much. And thank
you.
you all for listening to Sisters in Sobriety. And we will see you next week. This was Sisters in Sobriety.
Thank you for listening and being with us today.
If you want to learn more about sobriety and meet your community, find us at sistersinsobriety.substack.com.
Are you a sister in sobriety? Then reach out on social media. We'd love to hear from you.
If you're feeling generous, leave us 5 stars and a review and follow us wherever you listen.
You'll never miss an episode. Until next time.